alive.
Cool. Hi, everybody, and welcome to our talk. We are the Connection Group, and Hannah will start. Hannah?
So this is the last of our series of artist conversations. And yeah, this is the Connection Group, as Ben said, and we're going to connect with all of our artists as they introduce themselves.
Cool. So I'm going to share the screen as each artist introduces themselves and their work. There'll be like a visual representation of some of the works that they made last year. Cool. Does everyone see? Yeah.
Yeah, awesome.
So let's
Great.
start with Megan.
Cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Fritz, and I work primarily with assemblage, sculpture, and printmaking. And my body of work aims to explore the idea of function amidst dysfunction, and I try to explore that by making sculptures that made prints. Yeah.
Cool.
Hi, everyone. My name is Angie Liu, and I make structures that work with capitalism and absurd. And then it's based, all of them are interaction, and the theme is interaction. So we work with the artworks are all interactive, and the human factor is very important. And yeah, that's about.
Hannah.
So the title of my exhibition was Handle with Care, and it was just exploring vulnerability and connection in a time of isolation and disconnection, and cultivating a tender sense of self.
Beautiful. And then me, which is Ben Orkin. The title of my exhibition was Extra Safe, which comes from a make of Durex condoms produced in South Africa. And I was kind of just exploring or trying to figure out what made me choose an extra safe condom, and specifically in relation to thinking about the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s and how it affected the gay community and what the effect of that is today. Yeah, so that was my exploration last year. So what we did as a group was each person in our group gave one point that they felt resonated with their work as a whole. And because we are the Connection Group, everybody in the group felt that their work connected to that particular theme. So Hannah and I will go through each of the points, and each person will address how they felt that they were connected to a particular topic. So let me just stop the screen sharing. Cool. Hannah, over to you. Oh, no, sorry, it's my turn, sorry. Before we go into those points, we wanted to also address how everybody's 2020 was and how they felt that their work shifted or changed based on the fact that we couldn't access our studios at Michaelis. And so we didn't have access to materials and facilities. So how did everybody's work change last year? Let's start with Megan, maybe.
So my 2020 was definitely a roller coaster of a year. But I was lucky enough to have a garage at home that I could work in and produce work in. And it was filled with a whole bunch of objects that had been found at flea markets and things that my dad had collected over the years. So I had a lot of material to work with. And it was perfect because usually I work with assemblage sculpture anyway. So I was lucky enough to have materials to work with and space to work with, but I definitely missed the printmaking aspect of having Michaelis at hand and printing presses. So that's how my work kind of started shifting, and my sculptures started kind of creating traces and proof that they existed, and that started taking shape in the form of prints.
Great. Angie, do you want to go next?
Yeah. So my work's also changed a lot in terms of like scale and materials. I live with like my friends during lockdown, so the space is not like mine, so I don't have everything there. And then I also need the works I need to make are often large scale. So before lockdown, I have worked with like larger welding and woodworking and all those big equipment. But then because I live in a tight space, that I have to like turn to small scale stuff, and then the materials I have to basically use found objects because it's hard to source them during lockdown. And then yeah, besides that, when you finally at home, I have to work with like a Dremel, and that's the only tool that I have. And then I work around that as a, yeah. And then when I finally got back, I start working with highest, like bigger scale artworks when I get access to the machine. That's the only.
Yeah. Angie, you were the only person in this group who was in the same crit group as me, and it was very interesting watching how you worked with materials before we went into the lockdown, and during, and then after. There was kind of like a similarity, and there was a lot of play happening, but then I think at the end you kind of just perfected and brought everything together, which was really amazing to see. Hannah, do you maybe want to talk about how your year went last year?
Yeah, I don't know if I just disappeared there for a moment, but I wanted to create really big things. And I think everyone experienced having to kind of downscale for most of the year. And then finally, 1 month or so on campus, we could kind of expand again. But yeah, I was also living at home. So my art was over all of the tables that we had here. So there was always food on my art, or the dogs would chew up, sculptures. And it was quite chaotic, but I got more of a balance later on, but I found it quite difficult, mainly working in my bedroom and kind of having the art staring at me all the time. And it was just, you couldn't really disconnect, work from being able to relax at home. So I found that quite difficult. So I really, I think it was kind of nice in a way, because then I enjoyed going back to campus and, having the facilities eventually.
Yeah. I also found that working at home, it was quite intense to spend such a long period just focused on one body of work. But for me, I was one of the lucky students who has a studio at home. So I was working in my studio at home all year, and I tend to enjoy working by myself. So I was very lucky in that case. And I have 2 kilns. And yeah. So now we'll go into the 4 points.
Yeah. So we'll start with materiality and process, and how everyone connects to that. I think, would you like to start?
Yes. So the idea of materiality and process has always been really important to me, and in the way that I work. I find it really important to listen to my materials, especially because I work with found objects. I always like kind of sitting down and tinkering with everything for hours until I kind of decide how something will take shape. And usually the way that I work is by not having a very precise plan of how things will pan out, but kind of letting the process guide how the artworks kind of take shape and shift throughout the way that I work. So yeah, one of the examples, for instance, if I hadn't done that, one of my prints that I created, piano impressions, so it was an etching print, and I'd actually only planned to print the one side, but per chance the back of the plate got etched by the acid, and it kind of worked out perfectly that the image or the lines that were etched into the plate kind of ended up looking like sheet music. So it worked really beautifully or really well with the first or with the top layer of the plate. So by, allowing myself to be open to kind of changing my idea of something and allowing my artworks and materials to kind of influence me in the way that I make things, I think it's improved my artworks for the better. Yeah, so it's definitely a very important aspect of my work.
Yeah, and it's very freeing that you can allow the material to also, it's like a collaboration between yourself and the material, which creates the final outcome.
Exactly. Yeah, my supervisor, Stephen Ings, kind of likened it to an orchestra. So you have a conductor that kind of puts everything together. But once the instruments start playing, they create symphonies on their own. So it's just a matter of kind of putting everything in place and then seeing where things go and being open to that change.
Beautiful. Angie?
My work deals with interactions. So the theme is interaction because my work focused on working with automatas and like mechanical and sculpture, hybrid between mechanical elements and sculptures. And then it is important because in the world that we live in, everyone's so focused on technology and their phones and digital, and they become very separated from the humans and social interactions. So I want to create artworks that will bring people together, or at least to the artwork, and then engage with the artwork. And the artwork itself, like the 7 deadly sins of society, one of the 7 series, speaks about the different sins that we commit due to technology, like the improved fast food chains, or when you have social media influences, and what else? Like the war machines and vehicle tech, stuff like that, they all kind of bring us further apart from each other. So by creating artworks that will let the audience engage with it, they will start to reflect on what these technologies are doing to us. And then there's also the other artwork called Hand Spinner, deals with green energy. So it's a technology that requires the human to wind up the fan, and then the fan will drop it the weight that propels the fan. And the idea behind it is that humans, there's nothing that's actually for free. So the human power is the payment, and then what you get is the product of your labor. So that's also one of my focuses.
And did Materiality Process? What are your thoughts with that, with your art?
Well, the materials I use is kind of anti-capitalism, because I chose to use found objects, and everything that I use are either scavenged or that people don't want. So I take stuff, let's say waste computer parts and stuff from junkyards or friends that don't want them, and I break them apart and reuse them. So I repurpose something that's no longer useful to something that is useful again. And then this kind of speaks about the environment side as well, and the human interaction, and the consequence of technology on humans. And we're working out the opposite way to it.
Awesome.
What about you, Hannah? I feel like your work is a very kind of tactile and almost very physical, and the materials play a lot into that.
Yeah, so all the art shops were closed and everything during hard lockdown. So I started with just using materials around the house. So old bed sheets, stuffing from pillows, and, kind of just taking whatever you can find. I think that's been quite a big theme last year. And normally I have such a block in making art because I don't want to waste materials and everything. So in a way, having these cheap materials that were just lying around made it more comfortable to work with them. And, I was able to interact with it on a level of, being able to nurture these materials in a way. And I used felt, stockings, latex in the end, Crete stone, clay, a whole lot of random things. But with process, I found, the process of making, especially last year, I feel like everyone was forced into being a lot more internal. And then the practice of making and process, you know, I don't know, I think it all just really fed into each other, and I found it very meditative and, you know, very necessary to kind of work through that internal stuff going on and externalize that in these little, you know, I made like comfort objects. And yeah, so process and materiality was a very interesting thing to explore last year.
I think that all of us in this group kind of embraced working with something like very close to your hands. Do you think there's any relationship between what was happening last year, which was quite scary and out of our control, and then being able to work with the material with your hands, and that's very much in your control? Does anyone feel there's that connection?
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah.
It also makes like connects you to the home, like makes you realize how the small stuff around you is more significant when you finally like,
I think definitely for me also, and maybe more because I'm very familiar with my material. I've been working with it for as long as I can remember because my mom's a ceramicist. So I'm able to make work about things which make me feel a little bit uncomfortable sometimes with the material that's very familiar and comfortable to me. So the material is very important in my process. But I also last year really started thinking about what the material is, because I had a lot of time to engage with the material, and I started using different kinds of clays for the first time. But I thought of ceramics as, or the sculptures that I'm making as bodies in a way, because if you think about bones in your body, they are like solid and they keep you upright and strong, but they are fluid. And when your bones break, they manage to like heal themselves back together with fluid. And it's the same with clay. When it's in its like natural state, it's wet and you can move it around and you can shape it into different forms. But then when it's fired, it becomes like a stone and it becomes solid, and it kind of like lasts forever. And bones are the same like that. When they're outside your body, they are hard. And if you think about like the pyramids in Egypt, when they find people's graves, there's all that's left is most of the time is the person's bones and pottery next to the person, which I thought is like an interesting relationship. But I was also thinking a lot about glazing for the first time, because I've always glazed, but I've never thought why I glaze. And I realized that the glaze is like a seal or like a barrier around the vessel or whatever I'm making, and it protects the clay from anything that's on the outside or in the outside world. So yeah, it was very interesting. And I worked with kind of like natural colors and like slip, which is watered down clay, as the barrier. But then also I worked with colors which are quite shocking and like not natural colors, kind of to just really point to the fact that the glaze is not a natural way that the ceramics is. It's artificial and it's like a barrier. So that was my relationship to materiality and process. But I think
what I'd like to say about your work and what I like about ceramics, and I think your pieces really touch on that, is, you know, ceramics is when it's fired, it's a very hard, you know, surface, but it's also incredibly fragile. So if it falls, it can break very easily. And because I was exploring that, you know, contrast of fragility and, you know, that hardened exterior as well, and how they kind of, you know, relate to each other, and they're so different, but they also just, they are one. So yeah.
And it's interesting because some of your work, you can see like the outside is this hard exterior, but then there's little like soft bits that are kind of oozing out of it, which is really beautiful. And that kind of brings us to our next point, which is interaction. Some of our work, you physically have to interact with the work. Well, most of us. So can we maybe discuss that a bit further? Angie, I think yours is the most interactive, and it's all for the purpose of being interacted with.
Yeah, like I said before, the main focus is to engage in the artwork. But during COVID, because of the rules that you can't really touch the artworks, kind of defeats the point. But now, the vision was to let people engage, and then through the engagement, they're actually like, because most of the time art is seen as a sacred object that nobody can touch or you can only see from a distance. So by changing its meaning, it's more like interactive and you can touch it, and if some of them require you to break it even, or that non-sacredness speaks more to my artwork, which is like the found object and the human and the
I remember when I went to look at your exhibition, I was scared to touch anything because of
that's
COVID, but also because I was like, it's not normal to touch an artwork in an art space. But when you're in your studio, you're kind of so connected physically to the work that you're making.
Yeah, I have to tell like the audience to like, you're welcome to touch, and then they'll be like enjoying every piece and running through it.
Yeah.
And also some of them were quite hardy, because I remember there was one that you crank up a thing and it would lift, and then you let go and it's, wound down and like hit to the bottom. So it wasn't, tentative touching. It was like you were physically winding things up and everything was moving. It was awesome.
Thank you.
And Hannah, for you?
So this was always like a sticking point, the interaction part, because I wanted all of my work to be interactive from the beginning. And then obviously a month into the academic year, physical touch became hazardous. So it was only really the week before I was like setting up my exhibition that I decided that I still wanted my work to be touchable. So I just left hand sanitizer outside of my exhibition space so that people could cleanse their hands, because I wanted them to touch the felted objects to see that it was soft and not, grotesque, or, just to familiarize and normalize these objects so that they weren't, uncomfortable. That was the whole thing, was to try become comfortable with what was seemingly uncomfortable. So to touch, to normalize, or even, I think with your work as well, Ben, is like physically navigating yourself around objects, even without touch, because you walked, your objects were throughout the whole room. So you'd have to physically navigate your body as you navigated the space. So that's a very interesting concept for me. And yeah, that's just people interacting with objects and spaces as they interact and navigate their own internal processes. And
I remember with my first exhibition, it was all of my work was in this small little room in a gallery, and on the opening night I was kind of the only person in the space. Everyone was so scared to go inside and potentially knock something over. But it was quite interesting to see or to realize how conscious you become of yourself when you are interacting with objects, specifically in like an art setting. And I think for me, the theme interaction is like weird because people are so scared to come close to ceramics in general, but I feel kind of differently about it, because we interact with ceramics every day when we eating off it and using it for whatever we're using it. But maybe an interaction with my work is the fact that most pieces are built in parts and they kind of slot together because I'm limited to the size of my kiln. So I have to build things in parts, and then once it's all fired, they can be slotted into each other. And previously I was kind of unsure about how to deal with something that slots into itself or whatever, because I like something to be very like a singular form. But last year I kind of embraced that and showed that there were these points where parts connected or disconnected from each other. So that was my little interaction point. Megan?
Yeah, I had a very similar view to Angie. I wanted to disrupt that kind of hierarchy that's often felt between, like, if you're an audience in a gallery viewing artwork, it's like, oh, okay, I need to like kind of really conduct myself in a proper way. And I wanted to change that. I wanted to kind of maybe blur the lines between audience and kind of artwork. And because a lot of my artwork, it ended up being a little bit like a performance, like my sculptures ended up having a bit of a performative aspect in them. And I wanted the audience to be able to interact with them and kind of aid the performance, and then in a way become part of the artwork. So if you walk into my exhibition space, there's a big scale made out of little piano bits, so it's my piano scale. So if you walk in and you tap the scale, it will move, and shadows will go along the walls. So that kind of interaction of audience with artwork is really, really important, and something that was also really difficult now with COVID and not having a physical exhibition or grad show. I guess we did have a physical exhibition. But for interactions, I feel like my artwork kind of interacts with each other as well. So I have my sculptures that then create the prints that are also exhibited. And a lot of my sculptures, they're fluid, they're moved, they're often taken apart, like they're made, documented, and taken apart again, and then the parts are reused in different areas. So they all kind of intertwine. Yeah, so interaction formed a pretty big part of my work as well. And actually, the interesting thing is when we got back to campus, I was talking to Angie and looking at his work, and our work was actually really similar.
Yeah.
Even though, and we hadn't spoken to each other all
Yeah,
year.
we were in different rooms.
Yeah, we basically had like almost the same kind of concepts and ideas floating around. So that was really interesting as well, how, you know, we didn't know what we were making, and somehow that work interacted with each other as well. So that was, I thought that was really cool.
That's why we're the connection group.
Yeah, connect.
So the next topic is intimacy and vulnerability. Does anyone want to take that first?
I only have a small intimacy part. I guess I related intimacy, or I interpreted it slightly differently. So I kind of related it a little bit more to loss, or the idea of loss, which I think is always quite strongly linked to a performance. We always have this kind of inherent need to record a performance in some like physical way. And my exhibition aimed to kind of deal with that a little bit, and in the way, so for instance, I was working with a piano that I had gotten to take apart and turn into an artwork. And as excited as I was about that, it was also extremely sad. I was like, it took me a good couple weeks to even like start taking a little bit of that piano apart. Like I spend hours like just playing the piano and listening to the really out of tune notes that came out of it. And the pedal, if you press the pedal, it just kind of like flopped down. It didn't jump back up. And I felt a really big sense of loss, and I wanted the audience to experience that as well in my exhibition. Like even though, okay, the piano was turned into an art piece, which then again created more prints, I find it's still sad to see something that's made with so much craftsmanship and effort and time to have been taken apart. And now it's this sculpture or piano that can't play anymore. And I thought that was really sad. But that was kind of the point of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm.
And you created something out of that.
Yeah,
It
exactly.
wasn't like a complete destruction.
Yeah. I guess that the piano itself then made recordings of, an alternative form of recordings. So
Yeah, for sure. And I imagine for you, because a lot of your pieces were so small, there was kind of like a relationship between the audience who's interacting with the work and that intimacy between the two.
Yeah, that's the intimacy that I was gonna say. So yeah, when you interact with it, it's more like kind of comedy, like a comedy kind of thing that you see it act in a funny way, and then it brings kind of like a joy side and to the audience, you know.
Okay. Hannah?
Well, my work is basically all about intimacy and vulnerability. My process of making was very intimate. So, making the felt pelts that I had, the process was very intimate, and it was interesting with COVID, the tactility, we always had to wash our hands and everything. And when you're wet felting, you're kind of standing there for like 5 hours with your hands in a lot of soap the whole time. And it's like a rigorous process of cleansing, and then you throw it down, and then you scorch it with hot water, cold water, felt it again. So all of the processes were very intimate to make. But for me, especially with our theme of connection, human beings are hardwired for connection, and vulnerability and intimacy are very distinctly human traits. But we also shy away from it because it's, our weakness, or there's potential pain involved. So a lot of the time, we do kind of shy away from it or run away from intimacy and vulnerability. But what I was really interested in navigating was the strength in vulnerability and how it brings true connection between people. And so that's why I wanted people to touch the things that I made, so that, they can kind of just have something to hold on to and familiarize themselves with. I just really dig intimacy and vulnerability. I think they're really cool. And I think as artists, you're constantly, yeah. And you, Ben?
Well, I think I just said, I think I'm the opposite of you, because my work was more about fear of intimacy. And I made like completely sealed vessels that nothing could be absorbed into them, or nothing could be put inside of them, because they were just completely shut off. And even when I finished building all of my forms, they became like this wall. And it was something that I thought about a lot, like this wall that I was standing behind. So that kind of brings us to our next point, which is barriers, which was what my work was mostly about, barriers in intimacy and fear. And I read an interesting book by Walt Odets, who's a clinical psychologist who lived through the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. And he identified 3 generations of gay men who exist today. And those 3 are the older group generation who lived through the epidemic. And so a lot of them died because they were sick, but also they lived like through the 1970s during the sexual liberation period. So they had this period of being completely free and their sexuality being accepted by more people in society, but then all of a sudden having this AIDS epidemic, which completely shifted the way that they were seen, because the government kind of used it as a tool to like prove that gay sex is a sin, and this is the punishment for being gay. So there was that generation. Then the next generation was the middle group generation, who didn't live through the they were around during the epidemic, but they were growing up and they weren't sexually active during the AIDS epidemic. So when they were sexually active, they carried all these fears of observing how the previous generation lived and what happened to them. And then the final generation is the younger group generation, which is me. And this group of people is living like the older group generation lived before the AIDS epidemic happened, because there's a greater acceptance of sexuality, and there's all these medications available which make having sex safer. Like one of the works that I made was PrEP, present, post, which addresses like PrEP, which is a medication that you take before coming into contact with someone with HIV, so it protects you. And then there's ARVs, which is present, and that's something that you take when you are HIV positive, and it lowers your viral load. And then there's post-exposure prophylaxis, which is something you take after being exposed to HIV, and it kind of like kills the virus off when it just reaches your system. So the thing that I was trying to talk about was those three generations and the barriers between the generations. And I was kind of trying to think about, because I do feel like the AIDS epidemic has affected my identity, and maybe especially because being in South Africa, we have our own history of HIV and AIDS. When the government with Thabo Mbeki like refused to give out free access to ARVs because he didn't think it was going to work, and he told people to just eat healthy and you'll be fine, which obviously was not the case. So I was kind of thinking about all these barriers and this separation of people, and how identities are formed based on fears. And yeah, so that was my point on barriers. Does anyone else want to go next?
I'll just go. Mine was kind of like you said, like it's opposite of yours then now, because mine was like breaking the barrier in a way. So it's the opposite. And yeah, that's about mine. It's not much of a barrier in terms of art between artworks as well. They're like connected as well.
Yeah, but I guess you were trying to break that barrier, and especially based on what was happening last year, and there was these very clear divides being drawn between people, and people's bubbles being very clear, and you can't pass through to the other side. And a lot of the people in our group's work was about kind of breaking that in a way.
Yeah, I feel like I try to break the barriers, I suppose, by juxtaposing an expectation with a different reality. So a lot of my works, like for instance, a piano scale, usually you think of a typical like piano scale going up the keys. But I made an actual scale that was made out of piano bits, so it's a piano scale. And then I have oil paintings that aren't traditional oil paintings, but kind of like monotype prints that are made out of motor oil and ink. So they could technically be classified as oil paintings, but they're not technically oil paintings. Yeah, so that's kind of the way that I try to, I guess, push the boundaries on what was expected.
So with mine, I felt like vulnerability and barriers were very interlinked, because, you know, a lot of the time to protect ourselves from being vulnerable, we'll build walls and build barriers, you know, and I feel like it's very much connected to, you know, expectations as well, and this mold that we try to fit ourselves into or fit other people into. And yeah, I was working a lot with the idea of skin. So I was trying to externalize my internal processes, and that kind of came out in a lot of representations of skin or flesh. And, you know, my one performance piece that I did, I covered myself in liquid latex around my bust, and did layer upon layer upon layer. So that was also very process-based. And then, you know, cut upwards and then stitched into myself. And that was about kind of processing and unprocessing and relearning. And it was all based on that exterior, you know, our number one, you know, means of connecting with people is through physical touch. And then what is that when it is shed, or when we can no longer touch, like, you know, this last year has basically brought. So I think barriers is a very interesting topic, because they can be, you know, the physical ones that we erect in our environments, or just the emotional ones, or, you know, how they manifest in our different art practices with the mediums that we work with. Yeah, so yeah. Does anyone have any
Did
last?
anyone feel like a disconnect or a struggle? And this kind of touches on barriers between their expectations of what they wanted to make this year, and what they, I'm sorry, last year, and what they did make, or what they were able to make, and maybe like how they addressed the final period where we were allowed back on campus and where we could access our studio and materials. No one. Well, I don't really, I don't know. I think I went into the year with a plan, which I usually do, but the end result was very different. And I kind of enjoyed that there was like a freedom, and each piece that I made led onto something else. So it was like I was building a story, almost through these symbols that I used, because my older work, I used to think a lot about gay intimacy and bodies reflecting each other. And I made these very simple shapes, which became like these symbols. And I feel like last year, I took those symbols and kind of meshed them together to create their own words. So each piece feels like it's its own word, and it's saying something different to the previous piece, but they kind of have this line that carries through them all.
Mm.
Yeah, I think for me, I have a very free way of making art anyway, so I don't usually like have a complete set plan of what I'm going to do. But the difficulty for me, I found, was kind of just working in my space alone, surrounded by all my art, and you kind of start like looking at things and you're like, no, it's not working, it's not working. And when you're in studio, the kind of beautiful thing about being in studio is that you have these amazing interactions with your peers every single day, and somebody will come past your table and be like, oh wow, this is actually working, like, or this connects to that, have you thought about that? And those kind of connections I really missed, because it's very easy to kind of get stuck in the slump of, okay, everything sucks and nothing is working and I'm just staring at the same thing.
Yeah.
So that's something that I very much missed from last year.
Yeah, I also work similar to Megan.
Agree. Sorry?
Yeah. I was gonna say I work similar to Megan. Like mine was very spontaneous, and then the process, it's almost like a manufacturing process. But it's like I start with a random design, and then I just fiddle with anything I find around me, and then slowly you have like many prototypes. And from the prototype, you start working like which one you choose the best one from them, and you select that one, and then you make more prototypes, and at the end you have like final product. It is like more like experimental and spontaneous.
I kind of start with an idea of how I want things to be, and it never happens. So I always end up in the middle where I'm derailing because things aren't going according to my plan that isn't really, you know, so solid in my mind. But so what I learned a lot from last year with my supervisor as well, just kind of telling me just to continue to make and then you can kind of conceptualize around it later. Just keep making and keep working, and keep doing the physical act of creation, because I think I just overthought things too much, and I wanted to be spontaneous and everything, and overthought trying to be spontaneous. And, so that was a really nice part of last year, kind of being forced into, one space, which was at home, which was very, intense, but at the same time, kind of forced you to just make and just go through the motions and then see what happens at the end, rather than being fixated on a final product.
Yeah. I usually work completely on my own, but last year I had the privilege of meeting Diana, who is one of the PG DIP students, and she's here today. But after the lockdown ended, we started like meeting up with each other in each other's studios and working alongside each other. And it was really such an amazing experience to almost have a thinking collaboration with another artist who really gave me so much. And I'm very grateful for that relationship. But you're right in saying that when you're on campus, there's so much that you gain from just being around other students and accessing or looking at what they're doing and the mistakes they've made, or the things that they're thinking about, or the amazing things that they're making. So we lost something last year, but I think we also gained other interesting things which we couldn't have received without being completely locked up in our bedrooms or studios making work.
So to finish off, did anyone learn anything while they were working on their exhibitions last year, either during last year or even just reflectively looking back, something that's kind of clicked into place?
Megan?
You didn't learn a thing.
I feel like I've learned that my art teaches me a lot about myself. Through tinkering and stuff, I a lot of the times don't know what I'm making and I don't know what it means. And only by kind of taking a step back and thinking about it properly, I guess either my art tells me things about myself, or I read into it based on what I'm going through. Either way, probably both. I feel like every time I do kind of look at what I'm making or take a step back, it's just it's almost mind blowing. I'm like, oh my goodness, it all makes sense now. This part of my work relates to what I was going through while I was making it without me even realizing. And I thought it's just absolutely incredible how art can do that.
I liked what you wrote in your little introduction about how you can't, or we as people can't really understand when a relationship is broken, but we can see when a machine is not working. But I think that when you're working with materials, you do learn so much, and working with the material is how you work with other people. And so it's you're learning something from that relationship between yourself and the material, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, absolutely.
Angie?
I've learned to be more flexible in terms of ideas and materials because of this lockdown. So before I thought I had a plan, but then when the lockdown happened, then all your plans change. So you have to keep on working with different changing plans, because when we are allowed back, we have to change our idea, or some of us, or me, I have to change my idea again. So it keeps on changing and then improving, or some of them won't work anymore because you just didn't do it well enough at home. So basically adapt to whatever environment you get. So that's also a power of creativity and stuff.
Yeah. Hannah?
I think for our whole degree, I was very focused on trying to get external validation. And, you know, it made me very dissatisfied with what I was creating. So last year, kind of being disconnected from everyone allowed me to kind of try get validation from myself. And then, you know, it was kind of the happiest I've been with the work that I've made. So that was like the biggest lesson I was forced to learn in that situation. And just, you know, going into our theme of connection, you know, it's the connecting with other people, but, you know, I found the importance of, you know, connecting with yourself and your own kind of understanding of, you know, how you function and, you know, how you sit with yourself. So that was a very interesting experience.
I actually just realized something now, Hannah, that you and I were when we had our UCT orientation, we were in the same group.
Yeah.
And now we're in the same group at the end of our degrees. But it's been so interesting to see how everyone in our year has changed so much in 4 years. And this is obviously like the time in your life where you're figuring out who you are and what you want. But everyone has really changed so much. But they've kind of kept that core essence of who they are, I think. Yeah. But it's so cute that we're in the same group again.
I just remember because my mom told me that there was someone that she knew whose son was also going to study at Michaelis, and that he makes bread and has a bread Instagram. And then you were in my group and it was your bread Instagram.
Yeah. Cute.
Very cute.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. This is the end of our conversations.
Thank you very much. Yes, a wonderful closing note. Thanks a lot. And thanks to you as well, Ben, for what you said.
Of course, thanks to you as well for what you've done. Okay, bye everybody.
Oh, hang on, do we have a question? No.
This feels very much like last touch moments. So I just hope that, you know, we're all going to revisit these recordings and know how to find each other. And that hopefully the way in which all the details were uploaded onto the Michaelis site will actually be an added value for future years. So for the moment, we're all stuck in South Africa. There's not much traveling going on and, you know, art fairs and all. So hopefully we can really be a thriving art community locally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we make a message to ourselves in 10 years?
Yeah.
Hannah, you go first.
A message to all of us for 10 years.
To yourself. You're going to
To
watch
myself.
this in 10 years.
Yeah.
God. Hope you're thriving. Hope you're thriving and still making and just, you know, living a good, wholesome life out in the fields away from all civilization. But connection, still good.
Connection.
Yeah.
Nice. Megan?
Yeah, I hope that I'm still making in 10 years and I hope I'll figure it all out.
Same. I hope I can survive in the future till the future. And keep making art and make people like my art.
Nice. I'm going to say to myself, I hope that you're still the same person and you're still doing the same things and you've found happiness and love and health. Lots of love. Bye.
Love everyone. Love everyone.
Yeah. Okay, bye.